församlingen. Hare Krishna, Shri Shri Guru Gauranga, Shri Gopal Ki.
Bhaktivedanta Swami
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 So reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 6, Chapter 1, and today we have text 52. Dehi agyo jita satvargo.
Dehagyo jita satvargo.
Dehi agyo jita satvargo.
Dehagyo jita satvargo.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Karmana cha jamuyati.
Kamana chajamuyati.
Karmana cha jamuyati.
Kamana chajamuyati.
Dehi agyodita sadvargo.
Dehagyo jita satvargo.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Karmana cha jamuyati.
Kamana chajamuyati. Dehagyo jita satvargo. Dehagyo jita satvargo. Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Kamana chajamuyati.
Kamana chajamuyati. Dehagyo jita sadvargo.
Dehagyo jita satvargo.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Koshkar ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Karmana chadyamuyati.
Kamana chajamuyati.
Tejagyo jita satvargo.
Dehagyo jita sadvargo.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Karmana chajamuyati.
Kamana chajamuyati.
Dehagyo jita satvargo.
Dehagyo jita sadvargo.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Karmanashadyamuhyati.
Kamana chajamuyati.
Dehagyo jita satvargo.
Dehagyo jita sadvargo.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Nechan karmani karyate.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Koshakara ivatmanam.
Karmana chatyamuyate.
Kamana chajamuyati.
Tejasvi sattvargo
Tejagyotisattvargo
Nityam kama nikayate
Nityam karma nikaryate
Koshakarai vatmanam
Koshakarai vatmanam
Kamana chatya murti
Karmana chajamuyati
Dehi,
Dehi
the embodied soul,
the embodied soul
without perfect knowledge,
without perfect knowledge
Ajita Sattvargaha, who has not controlled the senses
who has not controlled the senses
of perception
of perception
and the mind.
and the mind
Na icham,
Naijan
without desiring,
without desiring
karmani, activities for material benefit,
activities for material benefit
karyate, is caused to perform,
is caused to perform
koshakara, the silkworm,
the silkworm
iva, like
like
atmanam, himself, karmana, by fruitive activities,
fruitive activities
acharya, covering, muyati,
Muyati
becomes bewildered.
becomes bewildered.
Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. The foolish embodied living entity, inept at controlling his senses and mind, is forced to act according to the influence of the modes of material nature against his desires. He is like a silkworm that uses its own saliva to create a cocoon and then becomes trapped in it with no possibility of getting out. The living entity traps himself in a network of his own fruitive activities and then can find no way to release himself. Thus he is always bewildered and repeatedly he dies. Purport. As already explained, the influence of the modes of nature is very strong. The living entity, entangled in different types of fruitive activity, is like a silkworm trapped in a cocoon. Getting free is very difficult unless he is helped by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Om Ajnanati Mirandasya Ganandana Salakaya Chaksuram Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So the first sentence of this translation by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada, he states that the foolish embodied living entity, inept at controlling his senses and mind. So as we know, this is an important factor in spiritual life. That is, in the practice that one controls one's mind and senses. This is especially important in the stage of practice where we not yet attain love for Krishna. The senses are not naturally attracted to Krishna in a spontaneous way. There is still attraction to the material nature, to material enjoyment. Then this part of controlling the senses and the mind is an important and required practice. And it is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam in the 4th canto, 31st chapter, verse 19, where Narada Muni, he speaks 3 simple instructions of how one can quickly satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he says, Tayaya sarvabhuteshu Tayaya sarvabhuteshu and then how it goes. Being merciful to all living entities, controlling the mind and sarvendriyo pasantyacha, tusyati asudanadana. The second line, it escapes me, but it is being merciful to all living entities, being satisfied somehow or other, santustya yena kena, there it is, dayaya sarvabhuteshu, santustya yena kena va, sarvendriyo pasantyacha, tusyati asudanadana. That means by being merciful to all living entities, being satisfied somehow or other, and controlling the mind and senses from sense gratification, one can very quickly satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan. So these three things actually is mentioned. Merciful, to be merciful to all other living entities, to be satisfied, and is mentioned somehow or other, and to control the senses from sense gratification. By these three things, one can very quickly satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Janardana. So it is interesting that this is one part of it, controlling the senses from sense gratification. This is one part of three things mentioned by Narada Muni, by which one can quickly satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So that's why it's very important, actually part of how one can satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because we should know that that's the goal of our endeavors, that is to satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's actually the benchmark, what we're looking for, if we're successful or not. So then we would like to know, well, how do we actually satisfy the Supreme Personality of Godhead? And we give it in these three things, MSC. We can say M for merciful, S for satisfied, and C for controlling the senses. MSC, Master of Science, is an acronym, so we can easily remember. But here it is said that the foolish embodied living entity, inept at controlling his mind and senses and mind, is forced to act according to the influence of the modes of material nature. So, unfortunately, the general condition, as the Yamadutas they are saying here of the living entities, that they are inept at controlling their mind and senses. They're not good at it. They're not at all equipped or able to control their mind and senses. That's what meant by the word inept. They're not able to do it. And therefore they're forced to act according to the influence of the modes of material nature. And as we know, this is especially true for this Kali Yuga, where it says Payanal Payusa Sabya Kalo Asmin Yuge Janaha Manda Sumanda Matayo Manda Pagya Hupadrutaha. And of course this verse states that the living entities in Kali Yuga, they are short-lived, that they are quarrelsome, they are lazy, they are misguided, unlucky, and above all, always disturbed. So, because this is there can be no question of controlling one's senses. Because the living entity, their life energy, it has been, you can say, so much depleted by all the negative or harmful influence of Kali Yuga. So they're basically in a helpless condition. Most living entities, we find that today they're completely empty, like dried out husks, because of engaging in excessive sense gratification. The results of it, that you become like a lifeless zombie, so to speak. It drains you of your power to control your senses by engaging in sense gratification. That's Prabhupada, he states in the purport to that verse. It is Srimad Bhagavatam 1.1.10, and it is stated that there are 4 things which depletes one's life energy, one's vital energy, and that is if one engages in over-sense gratification. Now the first thing mentioned is overeating. If one engages in overeating, if one engages in over-sense gratification, if one becomes over-dependent on another's mercy, and the last one is artificial standards of living. If one becomes addicted to artificial standards of living, then that one saps one's vitality. Can I have some water, please? That will drain the vitality of the living entity, and as we know, thank you, that's actually especially a fact for the people in Kali Yuga. You can see that their faces, they're lacking life. You know, they're pale faces, and they seem like completely lost. You know, and that is because this life energy has been drained away by engaging in these 4 things: overeating, over-sense gratification, over-dependency on others' mercy, and artificial standards of living. So when that condition is there, how can one control one's senses? How can one endeavor to control one's mind? So that is actually very difficult in Kali Yuga. So therefore, it is said that the foolish embodied living entity, inept at controlling his senses and mind, is forced to act according to the influence of the most material nature. So the unfortunate result in this condition of Kali Yuga, that is by completely giving ourselves up to the demands of the senses, we glide down into the mode of ignorance, being completely helpless, completely drained of all vitality, all life. And the result of that is that next life we get punished and we take birth in the animal kingdom. Because that condition is the mode of ignorance. And in the mode of ignorance, the result of that is that when one dies, one takes birth in the animal kingdom. And then one has to go through the cycle of species, 8,400,000 different species of life. And that's why it is said at the end of this verse that thus he is always bewildered and repeatedly he dies. So this is the unfortunate result of failing to control one's senses, of not endeavoring to control one's senses, is that one is drained of all one's vitality, and then at the end of it, you die and you go to the lower species of life. That is actually what happens. So therefore, Dayaya Sarvabhuteshu, merciful to all living entities, a Vaishnava who can see this, who can understand this, he becomes very compassionate because he knows that these people, they're completely helpless. They have completely become victims of their senses, and they're like dying, wounded people lying on the battlefield of this Kali Yuga. Any minute they will die, and the grim result of dying in that condition is that they will have to take birth as animals. And they will have to go through so many births and deaths. That is the result of the being victimized by their senses in this age of Kali Yuga. So therefore, the Vaishnava or devotee, he wants to somehow help them. And the very most effective way which they can be helped, which is stated in the purport of this verse, 4:31:19, is that the most best way to help living entities of Kali Yuga is to loudly chant the holy name of the Lord. Because by that chanting, the living entities, they will be benefited. They will be able to come out of their condition of being victimized by the senses, being in a helpless condition of life. So it's very interesting actually, because Lord Chaitanya, who came 500,000 years ago, it's interesting that his name, Lord Chaitanya, Chaitanya means living force. So we've just understood that in the age of Kali, we have been completely robbed of our vitality. Our unrestricted sense gratification has robbed us of all strength, all spiritual strength, even bodily strength has been depleted by excessive sense gratification in the age of Kali. So Lord Chaitanya, he comes and gives back the life to the living entities, both spiritually and even bodily. The result of getting in contact with Lord Chaitanya and becoming an agent of Lord Chaitanya by chanting the holy names of the Lord is that we give the life back to the dying living entities in Kali Yuga. The living entities which have become helpless, completely knocked out by the material process, they get their life back. So that's actually what goes on when we go out there and chant the holy name. That is that it's called when a person is brought back to life by a doctor. He's almost dying. There's an English word for this. And I believe the English word is resuscitation, isn't it? When a person is brought back to life from a dying condition. It's called resuscitation. So it's a resuscitation attempt. That when we go out there and chant loudly the holy names of the Lord, that is that we're trying to give the life back to the helpless, dying victims of Kali Yuga. So that's actually the mood in which properly the Harinam Sankirtan Yagya is properly conducted. It is, when we read the Srimad Bhagavatam, we get Prabhupada's, you can say, explanation of what the Harinam Sankirtan Yagya actually is. What is it actually that we're doing when we're out there chanting the holy names of the Lord? What's the deeper meaning? And it is said it's a yagya. And when we read in Srimad Bhagavatam, the result is that when a yagya is performed, a sacrifice, when a sacrifice is performed properly, what is the result? The result is that the Lord himself personally appears. Now, we find that for Dhruva Maharaj, he was executing his austerity, then the Lord appeared. And in Daksha even, he was also performing yagya, and we see that the Lord himself appears. And we find many other, Prithu Maharaj, as also example, he was performing great and opulent yagyas, and also at the perfection of the yagya, the Lord, he appeared. So as the Lord, he appears in the Vedic yagyas, the great Vedic yagyas which were performed in the previous ages. So, because this yagya, Harinam Sankirtan Yagya, is the prescribed yagya for Kali Yuga, that means when, and this is, you find this is repeated again and again by Srila Prabhupada in the Bhagavatam, when one performs the Harinam Sankirtan Yagya, then Lord Chaitanya appears. He appears directly there to be worshipped by that chanting of the holy name. So, because Lord Chaitanya, he appears, then the living entities, they get life. Lord Chaitanya in Kali Yuga, he comes personally and gives the life back to the living entities which have been wounded by this unfortunate atmosphere of Kali Yuga and have become, allowed themselves to become victims of the senses. And they can't get out, they're helpless. And explained in this verse, they're like silkworms which have made a cocoon which they cannot get out of. So that's actually the deeper meaning of the Harinam Sankirtan Yagya. And if you study the Srimad Bhagavatam, you will come across this again and again. Srila Prabhupada repeats it. It's a process of worship. when we go out there, we endeavor to worship Lord Chaitanya by the chanting of the holy name. And the success of it is that if we do it purely, then we become instruments of Lord Chaitanya. So we can perform this first part of how to satisfy the Lord. That is being merciful to all living entities. We become agents of the Lord's mercy. And it's also explained about Lord Chaitanya. Namo Mahavadanyaya. He is Mahavadanya. He is the most munificent, merciful incarnation of the Lord. So we connect ourselves with the mercy and compassion of Lord Chaitanya by executing the chanting of the holy name with that understanding and that mood. We become agents of mercy. And so we can perform this first part of how to satisfy the Lord, being merciful to all living entities. And then controlling the mind and senses and being satisfied somehow or other. So in this way, these three items, they are connected with one another. And the other items mentioned, we can say, well, how satisfied, how is that connected to the whole picture? Well, we can say one part of the devotee's life is that he is very satisfied. Because being dissatisfied means that you can say one cannot really be merciful to others. If we're in a